Hi, we're so excited to be partnering with New Orleans Entrepreneurs Week for the first Idea Pitch Winter Showcase. And our guest is our old friend and my very close friend, Steve Case. Steve, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Walter, and great to be part of Entrepreneur Week, even if it is a virtual participation this time.
I know, but we'll see you in person in New Orleans sometime soon.
Look forward to it.
Tell me about the lessons you drew from creating AOL and how they apply today.
Well, it goes back a long way, as you know. We started AOL 35 years ago this past summer, and in 1985. And at the time, only about 3% of people were online, and those 3% were online an average about 1 hour a week. So we envisioned somehow getting the world online, getting America online. We never fully envisioned we'd be living in a almost purely virtual Zoom world, obviously because of the pandemic. So it's been an interesting journey over those 35 years. The first 10 years in particular, frankly, were a struggle, and I think that's one of the lessons I try to pass on to the next generation of entrepreneurs. Is sometimes revolutions happen in sort of evolutionary ways, and there's a lot of kind of course corrections, and sometimes you feel like you're making progress, but something, some impediment kind of gets in the way and you have to take a step back. So perseverance was one of the key lessons I took away from that. The importance of partnerships was another one. We realized early on, we were a little company, we raised $1 million. We had some big competitors out there, including one you'll recall, Prodigy, backed by IBM and Sears with $1 billion. So we knew we couldn't compete head to head, so we had to figure out another strategy. And for us, that was partnerships with personal computer companies and modem companies and media companies, including that's when we first met, when I think it was probably 1991 or so, when you were the new media editor for Time Magazine and trying to get Time Inc. thinking more about the digital world. We had 300 partnerships like that really were critical. And the final one was the importance of understanding the role of policy and governments. Frankly, when we got started, hard to believe now, but when we got started back in 1985, it was still illegal for consumers or businesses to be on the internet. As you know, DARPA had funded it, a government agency, and initially it was limited, restricted to government agencies and educational institutions, but normal people, consumers, businesses, et cetera, couldn't use it. So we had to engage in a whole effort over a number of years to kind of usher in the internet age, commercialize the internet, support some policy and regulatory and even judicial changes, including breaking up the phone company, which drove down the cost of access. A bunch of things had to happen for the internet to take off. It wasn't just sort of there waiting. We and others had to push it. So to me, those are some of the lessons. Believing in your idea, recognizing that the people, the team, entrepreneurs with team sport, the team you put around you is critical. But really having the patience and perseverance to see it through. You're recognizing it's not just about you and your company, it's about building a network with other companies around, this partnership aspect, and being more respectful of the role of policy.
And one of the things you learned too was the importance of creative marketing. I mean, AOL expanded because all of a sudden you were getting discs and it was bound into magazines, and you had a whole new way of going viral before there was a digital way to go viral.
Yeah, and actually that created some tension. One of our partners in the late 90s was Apple. We had done a deal with Apple to license their brand name, which they'd never done before. I don't think they've done since, to create a service called Apple Link, Personal Edition. And our strategy, as you say, was to give our software free. We knew we'd make money not on selling the software, but getting happy customers, subscribers, members to sign up and pay us every month for hopefully many years. So we decided to give the software away. Well, Apple at the time didn't give software away. Nobody gave software away. In fact, they required that the Apple branded software only be available through authorized Apple retail stores, not more broadly. And in fact, we wanted to give it away, and they wanted to sell it only in their stores. There was some tension, which actually led to the breakup of that marriage, if you will. And we had to go our own way and had to rename Apple Inc. Obviously, couldn't use the Apple name, and that led us to rename it America Online, which then became AOL. So that was an example of frankly, at the time was a crisis creating an opportunity. But then as we started accelerating our growth, we realized that interest in the internet was starting to expand. We knew big companies, AT&T, Microsoft, many others were coming, so it never would be easier or cheaper to gain market share. And that's when we really slammed down the accelerator. And as you said, got pretty aggressive and and distributing those free trial discs. I do remember at one point we had a partnership with Omaha Steaks and included our AOL free sign-up disc with frozen steaks, which struck, maybe in retrospect, we were going a little bit too far. But the point was we wanted to blanket the country with these free trial offers, make it as easy as possible for people to try, because we really were confident if they gave it a try, they'd fall in love with AOL, fall in love with the internet.
I remember that one of your best and most important insights was the importance of community. And that whenever you're starting a company or you're an entrepreneur, you have to figure out ways, how do you develop a community around it? So explain how you did that with AOL.
Yeah, it's a great point. Any entrepreneur, including people participating in a pitch competition and this entrepreneur week, you have to figure out what their angle is, what their edge is, what's going to differentiate them. Why are people going to care what we're doing? And for us at the time when we entered the market, again 35 years ago, there were some reasonably big players, at least from the way we were looking at it, out there, like CompuServe, which was a division of H&R Block, and they focused on content, information, services. We knew Prodigy, the one I mentioned before, this joint venture with IBM and Sears, was going to focus on commerce. Home shopping was in the early days, back then. So we knew that some big players were going to be focused on things like content and commerce. What we could do was different, and that's where we really settled on community. And from the day one, we launched our first service in the fall of 1985. Community was front and center. We had things like chat rooms, people connection, instant messaging and buddy lists and forums and obviously email, things like that. And the whole time I was running, it was almost 20 years, over half of all the usage on AOL was these community features. So it turned out to be an important place to focus and connecting people who already knew each other so they could stay connected, and also connecting people to new people that had maybe similar interests was a key part of it. Obviously, since then, we've seen the evolution of social media platforms, Facebook in particular, that have taken that to a whole another level. But 35 years ago, that was a key insight, both in terms of striking a chord with a lot of consumers that we thought that would be like the killer app of the internet was going to be people, but also a way for us to differentiate with other competitors out there.
The notion that you were a pioneer of social media, especially in the digital age, how does that play in with the pandemic, where suddenly we're learning more about how to have virtual communities?
Yeah, I think we're all struggling to figure out how to deal with this pandemic, and obviously there's some terrible aspects to it in terms of how many people, 250,000 people have lost their lives, millions and millions of people have lost their jobs. There's a great anxiety in the country, and so there's some real challenges here. But I think there are also some opportunities, and that's what the great entrepreneurs recognize. How do you always look at the situation, evaluate the context, and figure out what's the best path forward? And for some companies, that means pivoting and doing some different things. And we've seen that in the last 8 or 9 months because of the pandemic. We've seen some of the companies we've backed at Revolution really see an acceleration of some of their growth because they got in front of some of these trends. A couple examples are obviously e-commerce has been building for several decades. We were, as we talked about earlier, one of the pioneers in getting that going. It was growing nicely every year. This year, it really dramatically accelerated. And one of the companies we backed called Big Commerce, a software platform, done very well, went public, very successful public offering, in part because of that acceleration of adoption of e-commerce. Another one, a company we backed in the telehealth space, talk space, has seen strong growth over the last number of years. They're particularly focused on digital mental health. It's really taken off this year because obviously with a lot of doctors' office closed, but a lot of people in need, particularly around mental health issues, how you can deal with that? Well, people, both the doctors and the patients started embracing something that maybe a year ago there was some resistance to, and certainly what you involved in with Tulane and so many other educational institutions, Teach for America, a lot of the work you've done. We've also seen an acceleration around obviously digital learning, where of course it would be better if people could be in class, but in many places around the country they haven't been able to be. So adopting some of these digital learning platforms have become more important. You have to adjust to them. They obviously does require some different skill sets. Sometimes that's a tough kind of transition. There are a lot of people, unfortunately, who don't have access to high-speed broadband, particularly in rural areas. That's a problem as well. But the pandemic, there are many problems that need attention, and obviously a lot of those are government has to focus on in terms of accelerating the development and distribution of vaccines and testing and all the things that have to happen there to manage this health crisis. But there's also an economic aspect to it, and that's where I think the entrepreneurs that are kind of nimble and agile say, okay, what are new things that come out of this, and focus on it. And we've seen certainly with Zoom as a platform, building on this notion of community, really seeing an extraordinary acceleration of their business, because there is this inherent human desire to be connected. And if you can't do that physically, you want to do that virtually.
We're going to end up though with a hybrid system, I hope, within 6 months or so, in which you have vacation sharing companies, places where people can go, and you have online stuff. How do you think the trends will accelerate so that people can be at the intersection of both the physical and the virtual?
I think it's going to be super interesting, and even in the office setting, I think we've, for many decades, the sense is in order to be successful, you need to cluster people together, ideally in one place, so they can bounce ideas off each other and be more creative and focus on execution. So there really was a strong bias toward people being together. Even in some of the big acquisitions in the tech world, the companies acquired were essentially forced to move to the headquarters so they could be part of that. We've seen an evolution of that, and now that's not as much a dynamic, and we've seen that step forward even further because of the pandemic. Now there's a recognition, while sometimes it is preferable to be in person and have that ability to kind of work together in a much more collaborative way, sometimes it does work well in a virtual way, and it certainly can be more convenient for people in a lot of different respects, and for certain tasks, certain aspects of running organizations, it actually works well, and sometimes even works better. But that's an environment where essentially we've gone from everybody physically being together to essentially everybody being virtually together. I think this next notion, this phase, as you're suggesting, over the next 6, 12, 18 months, is going to be this hybrid, where maybe half the people are in the office and half the people are working remotely. Well, how's that going to work? It's actually, I think, going to be very tricky, because even some cultural team dynamics are going to get tricky. Do the people working remotely, for example, feel like they're missing out? They're not in, as they said in Hamilton, the room where it happens. And does that lead to sort of mistrust? So I think we've learned it's relatively easy to operate if everybody's physically together. It's also proven to be surprisingly easy for a lot of organizations if everybody's virtual. It's going to be much harder in these hybrid worlds, and that's not just in the office setting. That obviously cuts across many aspects of our lives.
You wrote a really good book with a pretty good introduction called The Third Wave. Explain what the third wave is and how it might affect people pitching, new ideas for startups.
Well, first of all, I should say, for those who aren't aware, I did write this book almost 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago, and it ended up doing pretty well on the New York Times bestseller, et cetera, in part because Walter wrote the foreword, which I'm grateful for. Well, the backstory, as you know, but probably everybody doesn't know, is now 40 years ago, when I was just graduating from college, I read a book called The Third Wave by Alvin Toffler, the futurist. He's written Future Shock and a bunch of books, but The Third Wave in particular was the one that really connected with me, kind of resonated with me. And he was framing it as the first wave was the agricultural revolution, and then that led way to the second wave, which was the industrial revolution. And he was predicting, positing, hypothesizing, nearly a half century ago, that the third wave would be the digital revolution, the information revolution, the technology revolution. I remember reading this and just being riveted. Saying, I want to be part of that, and that's what I've spent most of my life, focused on. So when I decided to write a book that was partly a reflection on some of the lessons learned in building AOL and some of the challenges that you are well aware when we merged AOL and Time Warner. So some of that kind of I wanted to cover, but mostly I wanted to talk about the future. And I realized, which led me to decide to finally write a book, that some of the lessons we learned in the first wave of the internet would be applicable in the third wave of the internet. And the way I framed it in that book, as you know, was the first wave of the internet was getting everybody online. And it goes back to what I said at the very beginning. When we started at AOL, essentially nobody was online. It was sort of viewed as sort of a niche hobbyist, kind of almost hacker kind of thing. How do you get the whole world online, build the on-ramps, the servers, the connectivity, get the modems built in the PCs, et cetera. And that was the first 20 years, really the 80s and 90s. That set the stage for the second wave, which has been most of the last 20 years, which is because in that first wave, the internet was built. You didn't have to worry about that. So the focus was building on top of the internet, building software and apps on top of the internet, Google, Facebook, you name it. And that's really dominated the last couple of decades. I think the third wave of the internet is when the internet meets the real world, and it really starts changing in pretty fundamental ways, as we're talking about things like healthcare and education and the food and agriculture systems and so forth. And some of those lessons I mentioned that were key to me in the beginning of our discussion around the importance of partnerships and policy, perseverance, things like that, were not that important in the second wave, but are going to be very important again in the third wave. So that's why I did decide to write the book. And some of the things I wrote back then are starting to happen. I think it will accelerate over the next decade. The other part that I wrote about that's certainly starting to happen, and New Orleans is a great example of this, and New Orleans Entrepreneurship Week is a great example of this, is the rise of the rest. How do we have innovation flourishing all across the country, not just in a few places like Silicon Valley?
So the third wave, where the internet connects with reality, is a way to migrate away from the engineers of Silicon Valley to creative communities like New Orleans or Memphis or Columbus, where things are going. Tell me how a place like New Orleans should capitalize on that.
Well, as you say, there's a couple aspects to this I think are worth focusing on. First, in the third wave, if you want to innovate, disrupt, revolutionize things like healthcare, it's actually not just about the software you write, the coding side of things. Of course, that's important, but it's almost just the table stakes. The real action is how you get other people to embrace that, how you get nurses and doctors to use it, and hospitals to integrate it, and health plans to pay for it, and regulators to allow it. That's kind of where the battle is going to shift. So the skill set is not going to just be about coding. It is going to be around creativity, collaboration, communication, some other skills that I think are going to be very important as we enter this third wave. The other thing that's going to be very important is domain expertise. There's this sense in Silicon Valley that if ignorance is bliss, naivete is a competitive advantage. If you know nothing about an industry, you can bring fresh insights, and that has proven to be true in sectors like financial services. PayPal, they said, because they didn't know anything about the credit card industry, they looked at things in different ways and came up with some innovations, and that is true. But in healthcare, as an example, ignorance is not a competitive advantage. Not understanding how the healthcare system works is not a competitive advantage. Not having credibility to partner with major kind of health organizations is not a competitive advantage. Not understanding the very complicated rules of the road in terms of policy or regulations around healthcare is not a competitive advantage. So understanding something about the industry you're trying to disrupt will become more important in the third wave than it was in the second wave. And as you know, many of the industries that are most important parts of our economy, most central parts of our lives, are spread all around the country. It's not just on the coast, not just in places like Silicon Valley. So that creates the opportunity for the rise of the rest more broadly. New Orleans, I think, is doing a great job, as you know, visited many, many times, including our Rise of the Rest tour. And I remember doing our little version of a Mardi Gras kind of as part of that, which you were part of, and seeing what was happening there, and having gatherings like Entrepreneurship Week is important. Having places to cluster like the Idea Village is important. Having great universities like Tulane really leaning in and trying to focus on strengthening the startup community is very important. A lot of it is collaboration at that local level, not just focusing on existing businesses, existing industries, but kind of leaning into the future, focusing on the companies of the future, the industries of the future, and recognizing that the big job creation engine in your community 25 years from now are not going to be your existing big companies, some of which are going to fall by the wayside. That's just what happens with this process. But some of the new companies starting today that you probably aren't paying attention to, but could be the giant companies of tomorrow. When Amazon got started, Jeff Bezos was pitching this idea of like online books. Most people are like, that's not that good an idea. And if it is, oh, by the way, Barnes and Noble is already off doing it. So most people around the country would think, well, that's not something we really want to champion. Well, now I think he has over 1 million employees and expanded in other businesses, and is one of the big job creators in the country. That was a little fragile startup, a quarter century ago. What are the little fragile startups today in New Orleans that have the potential to be the anchor companies in New Orleans 25 years from now?
What role can an incubator like Idea Village here in New Orleans or Tulane play in doing this?
It's critical. One of the things we found now is we've traveled around the country as part of the Rise Rest, and as you know, we've done, other than this year, we had to obviously postpone our bus tour. We've done 8 of these bus tours, visited 44 cities, and each city is a little bit different, but there are some things that are pretty consistent as we've traveled around. And one of them is the importance of collaboration, getting different parts of the community working together in a much more integrated, kind of way. There's a role for universities. There's a role for the big existing companies. There's a role for the mayor and the governor. There's a role, obviously, for the entrepreneurs, and figuring out ways to mix that up and create the connections, the collisions, the collaboration is critically important, and particularly do it in a more inclusive way, which I think is a particular opportunity for a city like New Orleans. If you look at the data around where venture capital goes, it's pretty sobering. It's both in terms of place and also kind of race. Last year, over 75% of venture capital in this country went to just 3 states: California, New York, and Massachusetts. So the other 47 states, including Louisiana, are fighting over 25%. Most of these states, including Louisiana, but also Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Michigan, are getting less than 1% of venture capital. California alone is getting 50%. So if you look at place, it's pretty staggering. And given the role startups play in job creation, it's part of the reason we have some parts of the country that are growing and other parts that are declining, and some people that are optimistic about the future, a lot of people that are anxious about the future. If you go beyond the place and look at some other data, last year, even though women represent half our population, female-founded companies got less than 10% of venture capital. That makes no sense. And even though Black Americans represent 13% of our population, they got less than 1% of venture capital. So it does matter where you live. It does matter what you look like. If you have an idea, whether you really have a shot of building a company, really a shot at the American dream. We just need to level the playing field so everybody everywhere has that shot. And cities like New Orleans that are more diverse than other parts of the country can really be leaders in driving a more inclusive approach to innovation and a more inclusive approach to startups and a more inclusive approach more broadly to capitalism.
You talk about the need to be engaged in policy, especially in the third wave. And you've written an op-ed recently about the need for policy to promote business and startup business growth. With the new administration coming in, and a close colleague and friend of yours, Ron Klain, being the chief of staff will be chief of staff to President Biden, what are the type of policies that you think they should be doing?
Well, first of all, President-elect Biden, when he was running as part of his economic program, his Build Back Better program, did outline a number of things that tie in with some of the topics we're talking about, including the rise of the rest. How do you get capital flowing to more people and more places? How do you create a more inclusive innovation economy? So I think there's some of that's already in place. You mentioned Ron, been a partner for almost 15 years. He did leave us for 2 years to be chief of staff to then Vice President Biden, and then came back and then left for 5 months to be the Ebola czar for President Obama. But for most of the last 15 years, we've worked with him, and he's left to go serve the country again, which obviously we have a great respect for. He certainly brings some of that perspective around the importance of startups. The lesson to me, and this is, as we've talked about in the past, was a little bit of a wake-up call. I was kind of, for a while, busy focused on building a business, AOL, and started making some investments, kind of minding my own business. It was only about 10 years ago that I got involved on the policy side. I was asked by President Obama to chair an initiative called Startup America, worked on in a bipartisan way on the Jobs Act, the Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act, did a bunch of things. And in that process, realized the central role startups play in job creation, that it's not the small businesses or the big businesses that are job creators, it's the new businesses. And that was news to me. And that's what led me to focus more on how do you create more new businesses? How do you do it in a more inclusive way? How do you do it in more parts of the country? And that led to the kind of the rise of the rest. So building on some of those ideas are critical in the short run. Some of the things that I think should be considered with a new stimulus program is trying to figure out ways to be helpful to startups. Maybe there's a way where you can provide capital for them if they agree to create a certain number of jobs, and if they create those jobs, they can keep the money. If they don't create those jobs, they have to return the money. You're looking at ways to redirect some of the funding that's already been approved towards more of these inclusive communities is important. Senator Amy Klobuchar introduced some legislation called the New Business Preservation Act that would take some Treasury money and put it in the hands of some regional venture capitalists, which could have a kind of catalytic, really transformative impact on some of the startup communities around the country. Those are some of the specific policy things, but the most important is just getting people focused on the role entrepreneurs play, startups play, and not just driving innovation and economic growth, but also driving job creation, and just having that mindset. It's not about the past, it's about the future. It's not about existing companies, it's about new companies is the most important thing of all.
Having written a book about the third wave, what glimmers do you see that might be a part of the fourth wave?
I don't know. I'm still focused on the third wave. I've learned these waves are like 20 years, kind of chapters. And that first wave took 20 years. The second wave took 20 years. My guess is the third wave is going to take 20 years, and we still have good ways to go. I do think we talked about some of this. The COVID wake up call, I think, is going to have an interesting acceleration in terms of some of these trends. We've already seen some interesting early signs of migration of people, including from places like Silicon Valley, going to other parts of the country. I think they went there thinking that it was temporary, but for some of them, they've decided to make it permanent, and that could really accelerate sort of some talent flows, which would be very helpful to the rise of the rest. As you know, there's been a big brain drain in many parts of the country over the last, really half century, where people growing up in certain places are going to university in certain places, then decide to leave because the opportunity is better in a place like Silicon Valley than it is where they are. Slowing that brain drain and creating a boomerang of talent has been one of our key objectives when we launched Rise the Rest, and we're seeing that accelerate. We're also seeing some of the trends around technology, consumer adoption accelerate. We talked about some of those earlier: telehealth, e-commerce, things like that. And so I think recognizing that this is a moment, and it's sort of a shake the snow globe for us as individuals, for communities, for countries, and how do we come out of this pandemic in a better place and not try to get back to normal, because a year ago normal wasn't working for a lot of people, a lot of places. There was, as you know, a lot of frustration, a lot of focus on is capitalism broken, how do we reboot it to be more inclusive, why are these big tech Silicon Valley companies having such a dominant role in our society. Things were not all that great a year ago. We've had this, we're still in it, obviously, the situation with a pandemic. How do we come out of it stronger and create a kind of a new normal, as opposed to trying to get back to normal? I think that's the opportunity for all of us. And I just believe entrepreneurs are going to continue to lead the wave. And that's why it's so important, things like New Orleans Entrepreneurship Week, to gather entrepreneurs together, to help them share perspectives, lessons learned from mistakes, lessons learned from successes, so this next generation of entrepreneurs can really take off, and not just see those companies take off in places like San Francisco, New York, Boston, but also in places like New Orleans. And we've seen that. We've made a number of investments, as you know, in New Orleans, including one that you're part of. It used to be called Ready Responders, now called Ready. It's scaling quite rapidly. We also invested in Lucid, which is scaling quite rapidly. So we're seeing it in New Orleans ourselves, and we're excited to look for other opportunities to invest in New Orleans alongside you and others who really believe in the entrepreneurs in New Orleans.
Well, one of the most memorable scenes in the history of entrepreneurship, in my mind, was you on a makeshift Mardi Gras float wearing a crown, which your wife Jean said suited you very well to have a crown on, listening to a whole bunch of pitch competitions and sprinkling the ideas out as if they were Mardi Gras beads. So I really want to thank you, Steve. And I want to say next time we'll do this again in person, maybe on a float and maybe with a crown on your head. Thank you for joining.
Look forward to it. Thank you, Walter, and thank you all. Keep fighting and stay safe.
Thanks. And now let's see those pitch competitions.